It is very easy to be wrong in the desert. Thus began my teacher in his introduction to our module on the dry lands. I'm enrolled in a continuing education course learning how to design sustainable and ethical human settlements that mimic the abundance and regenerative quality of natural systems. The philosophy anchoring this approach is called permaculture. Our teacher is leading us through design strategies for each of the main climate types. Humid, cool to cold, which is us in this part of Canada. Humid tropics, which is where I want to be on vacation right now. And the dry lands, which is where we find ourselves in our scripture this morning. Arid landscapes or dry lands are defined as evaporation exceeding rainfall. More water is leaving the landscape than is entering it, and that poses unique design challenges. It is in the dry lands that Lent begins. And into the wild we must venture as we learn to follow Jesus Christ. Permaculture approaches each landscape to be designed as a series of roughly concentric circles. These zones are laid out according to how often we use or need to care for something. So zone 0 is you, the human person. We should probably take a shower every day. Zone 1 is your shelter, the place from which you venture forth into the world. Zone 1 is the place of intensive care and self-reliance. Zone 2 is a spot you might visit weekly, perhaps a tree to prune or harvest from. Zone 3 is less intensive still, and Zone 4 might be for foraging or firewood. For our purposes today, it is Zone 5 we are most interested in. For Zone 5 is the part of the landscape that is left intentionally unmanaged. Every property needs a Zone 5, writes author and designer Toby Hemingway. It's the wild land. Whether it's a corner of an urban lot dedicated to a wildlife thicket and a few rustling birch trees, or a nature preserve on the back 40, it is where we are visitors, not managers. We design the other 4 zones, but we enter Zone 5 to learn from it. There we observe, we play, we meditate, and we let the land be. Zone 5 is the instruction manual for keeping our lives in tune with nature. Whether you are experiencing homelessness, are marginally housed by a terrible landlord, or live in a mansion in Rosedale, we are all equals in Zone 5. Whether you're a rainmaker at King and Bay or standing at that intersection panning for change. For here in the dry lands, evaporation exceeds rainfall. And all that we thought was important vanishes into thin air. It is very easy to be wrong in the desert. Perhaps the most surprising fact of the wilderness is that Jesus is there too. I say surprising because you and I largely exist in zones 1 to 4, dominions over which we exert our competency and control. And this is the place we much prefer to encounter God, as a fixed piece within a design of our own creation, where he stays just where you last saw him in church on Sunday morning. In the lives we've designed, we have, by accident or on purpose, excluded Zone 5, the wild. We have designed an existence that crowds out all that we cannot fathom or manage. But in crowding out Zone 5, we also crowd out the possibility of a God we do not control. And that is the only God who can save us. Years ago, I served a parish that found itself swallowed in profound conflict. It was so awful that the diocese, for only the second time in its history, deployed the entire College of Bishops to perform an exorcism over the parish as a whole. I'm not making this up, for I was the incumbent while this happened. This was probably the worst time in my entire life, and I thank God for an older, wiser priest who mentored me very intensively through this and saved my life in all the ways that matter. When I was trying to decide to stay or to leave for the sake of my family, this mentor would playfully adopt the voice of God and say to me, "Oh, what? You're still at that church? I left there years ago." All that to say, God will not be managed or bargained with or controlled. God does not show up in a church building just because we tell him to. God has no fixed address. And sometimes, in my experience, God will leave the building we tried to lock him in just to prove a point. For it is the Spirit of God who leads Jesus into the wilderness, to the zone beyond human reckoning or control. In the dry lands, the design consideration that precedes all others is water. Without water, nothing can live. This desert climate is where, for Jesus, everything will be gained or lost. How fitting, then, that the first time we meet Jesus as an adult, his cousin John is baptizing him in the River Jordan. And there Jesus is, letting soak into every pore and down into the deep aquifer of his being the truth that must precede and establish his entire ministry. Words of love spoken aloud by the God he called his Father. "This is my Son, the beloved. My favor rests on him." Jesus would need every drop of that assurance to face the trials ahead. The devil first tempts Jesus when he's on the verge of starvation. "Prove you are a child of God by turning this stone to bread." Take that which is fundamentally not nourishment and eat it and live off that. We know what that stone tastes like. Alcohol as painkiller, credit card as self-care, overwork to numb the problems at home or hide the fact that no one's there. Jesus refuses to eat it. One does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. It may be that Jesus, in his hunger, starts hallucinating. For the devil's second temptation carries Jesus in his imagination to the top of the cathedral spire at the center of town. And that slithering snake tempts Jesus to self-harm. "Are you really God's beloved? Doesn't look like it to me. Just one jump, and let's find out. Some of us have heard that seductive, malevolent voice, or believed the lie that our career and reputation and view from the pinnacle would be enough to bear us up. Jesus refuses to believe it. Do not put the Lord your God to the test. Jesus is on his hands and knees now and finds himself staring over the edge of a cliff at the kingdoms of the world. And the devil says to him, "You're already on your hands and knees. All that's left is for you to worship me, and this can all be yours." For in the midday heat, even sand can become a mirage, shimmering like a pool filled with all the lies you most wish were true. All it would take is a little lie, a small abuse of power, an affair with a former staffer. No one has to know. Jesus refuses to listen to it. "Away with you, Satan, for it is written, 'Worship the Lord your God and serve only him.'" The church reformer Martin Luther once said, "The best way to drive out the devil, if he will not yield to texts of Scripture, is to jeer and flout him, for he cannot bear scorn." And the devil fled. And this is how the angels found Jesus on his hands and knees at the edge of a cliff, with his ribs poking through, out of water but full of joy. For Jesus had faced hell and kept on trusting God. Exactly 3 years ago, I stood in this same pulpit to launch our strategic plan. Our mission, vision, and values had ripened, learning to follow Jesus Christ, transforming lives, living the fruits of the Spirit. 3 weeks later, the pandemic struck. For many of us, the past 3 years have been hell. Winston Churchill famously said, "When you're going through hell, keep going." We have kept going, and we have carried one another's burdens, and in so doing, fulfilled God's purposes. There's a part of me that is tempted to promise you that the death and drying up of the pandemic is all behind us now, that we'll be getting back to normal soon, that if we just tweak this or quick fix that, things will be as they always were, and we can leave the wilderness behind us forever. But I cannot say those things because I am a terrible liar. And God has placed me here to speak the truth. And the truth is that we are not getting back to normal. And the world in front of us is nothing like the world behind us. On Thursday, we learned that Tom Fitch's former director of music here for 40 years had died. Tom's death is itself a sign of the ground shifting all around us. We cannot go back to the way things used to be because that place does not exist anymore. The journeys God leads us on, whether 40 days or 40 years, are not themselves the end. They are landscapes and seasons and waymarkers on a map, and important ones to be sure. but the journey continues. People of St. Clement's, today is Sunday, the day of resurrection. I am asking you to trust me enough to follow me off the map to a place that neither of us has been before. It's called the future, and it is the place from which God now calls us. I'm afraid this is neither a tour package nor a planned itinerary. There is no refund policy. There is no plan B. I cannot see where the road ends, but I do know where it begins. It begins today, walking with Jesus into the wild, a place of wild beasts and incredible extremes, of temptations and triumphs, of stunning beauty and unexpected provision. As Pastor Todd Bolsinger writes, the answer is not to try harder, but to start a new adventure. It is the adventure of learning to follow Jesus Christ, and I'm asking you to go on this adventure with me and with one another. We will pass through death and back before it's all over. But on that other side, I swear to God, is a garden and an empty tomb and a promised land, and we will get there together if we trust God. Let's go.